Good morning. I'm here to greet the vinyl community. I'm going to read out the second part of this chapter that I read before, Early Evasions in the 80s. I read half of it yesterday. I'm going to try to finish the other half today. When I looked up what DiCarlo told Bugliosi as part of his deal, I was confused to find that he had just recited the script of Devious DA provided for him, not a word about freeing Bobby Beausoleil. One method Charlie used to relay information says a great deal about the way he operated. He put me in touch with several ex-cons who were recently done time within Vacaville and San Quentin. By far the most memorable of these was a bank robber recently paroled from Vacaville, one of two of the professions he connected me to. Charlie told me that he instructed his former prison pal to tell me something in confidence that he could not say over the phone or in writing. When I met Charlie confident in the remote Northern California location, he proceeded to relate to me that Charlie told me him was the actual chronologically and timeline of the Cielo Drive's killing, as opposed to the story of the public have been told in the mafia. When I was told was, you will soon read entirely different than what Helter Skelter one goal of the crime, which is my first inkling from Charlie himself that there was more going on than the girl's unlikely pipe dream of freeing Bobby. I was told Charlie on the telephone that I met his girlfriend and that he passed along his message. Charlie then carried out a maddeningly convincing job of acting like he'd never heard of the person or he'd actively arranged for me to meet. He pretended to have no idea what I was talking about. He subtly amused tone when he said that this made it clear that, of course, he knew exactly what I meant, but he was not going to acknowledge it. I got the picture. The subject was never brought up again until decades later when we discussed it in the context of this book. Several times over the next decades, other cons and criminal associates of Charlie's called me to relay messages from our mutual friend. Once he was even sent a recently paroled convict to hang around my Sunset Strip post office box to personally deliver a cryptic message to me. There were always discrepancy in Charlie's vague and infrequent references to the crimes he was convicted for, whereas most of his anecdotes were vivid, detailed, rich with incident. His laconic comments about Tate LaBianca sounded too rote and well rehearsed to be the truth, nothing but the truth. And none of the police interviews conducted with him at the time of his arrest has yet to surface. I still wonder if he said anything about more specific to detectives back in '69. In trying to decipher his asides, insinuations, and implications, I knew there had to be more to the mystery than he was willing to say. Sometimes you could feel the weight of the secrets he kept within him. Since the murders weren't the main focus of my work with him, I didn't yet press him on inconsistencies. Both my book and film were primarily occupied with his philosophy, his spirituality, his songwriting, and his socio-political views, what Charlie called the thought. I didn't doubt that the bloody slogan left at Cielo Drive and especially at Waverly were a direct mimicry of the gruesome graffiti Beausoleil left at Hinman's. This seemed so inarguable, I never could fathom why Bugliosi played the far-fetched helter-skelter card when he could have easily persecuted the defendants with the equally abhorrent attempt to free a murderer by committing deceptive copycat crimes. Surely a verdict would have found that far more likely scenario just as worthy of the death penalty as the far-fetched notion of starting a race war based on Beatle lyrics? Could it really be as simple as that? Wouldn't be weird enough for a best-selling book or evil enough to justify a career in politics? What nagged me is that the love of brother motive played a part in the mayhem. Why there were those particular targets selected to manifest Sadie's schemes. Even less logically, it is easily established that Charlie Tex and his girls had visited the Cielo Drive property several times. He'd also been a frequent guest of Harold True, the next-door neighbor of the LaBiancas. It was Linda Kasabian, prior to linking up with Tex. Why would an inexperienced criminal like Charlie, already nervous about being sent back to prison for the Crow and Hinman incidents, order his allegedly mindless slave to kill supposedly random victims at locations the police could so directly connect to the culprits. The scant references to the crimes of the 88 Manson file hinted at Fatowski's drug dealing and Sebring's sexual sadism as possible triggers for the murders. Despite those causes seeming more reasonable to me, I was more or less informed by the byways at the time than anyone else interested in the case. Whatever compelled Watson to his atrocity, I never believed that the house where the attacks took place were chosen at random, nor did I find it credible that the killers didn't know at least some of the victims. In August 69, there was roughly 6,989,910 Los Angeles that could have been killed and fulfilled the copycat caper. All the random victims, it seemed too much of a coincidence that the ones who drew the short end of the stick just so happened to include two drug dealers, known most of Charlie's closest musician friends, and one greatly indebted grocery store owner with proven mob ties, even the police publicly acknowledged. Especially since the two lesser-known crimes that preceded them, the Crow and Hinman episodes, were conflicts about drug dealing debts. This wasn't just intuition. In the Hollywood music and movie that I moved through in the 80s, only about 15 years after the murders, plenty of industry veterans remembered how closely interlinked the Polanski and Manson cliques were. I knew that almost every time of the movie and music personalities, Charlie did admit to knowing between spring of 68 and summer of 69, among them the Beach Boys, Dean Martin, the Mamas and Papas, Terry Melcher, Candice Bergen, Troy Donahue, Jane and Peter Fonda. All knew Sharon Tate. And in the brief time period when Tate was, so was Sebring. How could it have been mess then? Charlie spoke of me frequently of hanging out with Mama Cass Elliott at her Woodstock drive home. His love-hate remarks about her often centered on her dependence on drugs. It was already well documented that the singer was regularly visited by Fatowski and Folger. Not only was Elliott and her bandmate John Phillips intimates of Charlie's friend Dennis Wilson, Phillips was also one of Roman Polanski's closest friends. To be sure, Polanski told homicide detectives Earl Deemer that Charlie's friend Cass Elliott was bad news from beginning to end. I hardly knew her. Bad news. I mean, just stay away from her. I don't like her from the first time I met her, but with so many mutual friends mingling between Spawn and Cielo, how was I to believe that the complicit members of the commune had no idea who was in the house and they visited the carnage on? In 87, when I heard witnesses' reports from a movie industry technician who recalled spotting Charlie and Tate in close proximity at the same social and cultural events, Charlie readily admitted without any hesitation, Neil Emmons already confirmed to me that Charlie told him about encounters with Tate. He decided not to include them in his book so as to avoid repercussions from the Tate family. The publishers balked on naming other famous names. What's more, Charlie was suspiciously well informed about the sex lives of Tate and Polanski, knowledge impossible to accord with the random victim scenario. One of the more ludicrous statements he made to me about the crimes was that Tate deserved to die because she was having sex with so many men while she was pregnant. I asked him if the pregnant girls in the ranch weren't just as promiscuous. The real question here was if the victims were unknown to the killers, on what basis could Charlie possibly make a head count of Tate's lovers? Though he never said to me, Charlie often made the flimsy claim in some interviews that the only reason Watson went to 10050 Cielo Drive was because he knew the layout of the house. Kasabian also claimed in her false testimony at Watson's trial that the only reason they went there was because Tex had been to the house before and he knew the layout of the house and just to do whatever he told us to do. If the plan was simply to kill any old random stranger to make it look like Hinman's killer was still at large, a plan that failed miserably in either event, then why was knowledge of the crime scene's layout a prerequisite? Presumably, Watson knew the layout of many other houses he visited in his drug-dealing sounds. So why that one? Well, there was Charlie's oblique ongoing references to mobsters' involvements in the crimes, especially but not only the La Bianca slayings. He could naive, idistically, chicks selflessly killing for the love of brother Bobby, possibly connected to the mercenary aims of brutally pragmatic organized crime? Charlie consistently maintained that one of Bugliosi's tasks in the trial was to suppress any information about LaBianca's syndicate involvement, the goal being, according to Charlie, to ensure East Coast control of Los Angeles crime networks. Again, why would such traditional underworld operations be relevant to the copycat killing scenario? In May of '88, a month after my own interview with him, I watched Charlie drop cryptic but clear hints about mafia motives in the LaBianca murders to a seemingly clueless Geraldo Rivera. This was the turning point in my skepticism about freeing Bobby's story. I would also lock horns with Rivera that year. Of the record, with no camera whirling, during a private meeting we held in San Francisco, Rivera was more receptive to the possibility of a hidden underworld current to the crime. Equally baffling, Charlie often stated that the LA powers that be and their puppet media convicted him before the trial even started, so that the biggest scandal in Hollywood, sordid history, could be concealed and averted. Didn't that imply that beautiful people Tex killed had something criminal to hide, and that Tex had at least an inkling of what the scandalous something was? Charlie's public statement to journalists about the crimes was even more confusing and self-contradictory. They often didn't collaborate with what he told me and other mutual friends of ours privately. As I was doubtful about some of what Charlie related to me about the murders, I didn't believe one thing he insisted on again and again, that he did not order Tex or the others to kill anyone at Cielo Drive. Shortly after my first exchanges with Charlie, I was shown the then hard-to-find complete trial transcripts by a lawyer who had then in his possession since 1972. Reading through the massive and often monotonous documents and several trips to the attorney's office, I was shocked to see that the whole case against Charlie rested almost entirely on the testimony of one witness, Linda Kasabian. The evidence supporting the accusation that Charlie commanded the killers to slay for him was so flimsy it was hard to believe that the jury accepted it as credible. What really captured my attention when pursuing the conviction phase of the trial, as I will come to examine more closely, was Susan Atkins' explanation of motive that struck me as making perfect sense. She said she was enlisted that night by Linda Kasabian, who told her that she'd been burned by someone at Cielo Drive in a drug deal. If that was true, then whatever part of the copycat plan played in that first night of mayhem was obviously a secondary killing, two birds with one stone, detailed to the far more mundane criminal motive. Atkins confided in many other intimates later in life that she was well aware the week of the anger Watson, and Kasabian felt towards Fratowski after the drug burn. They made no secret of it. It appears to me that Susan's copycat plan, Linda's fury at Fratowski ripping her off, and Charlie's desperate need to get money to pay the straight Satans fueled the urgency of the moment, fueled by the demonic logic of the meth percolating in the tweaking minds of Tex, Sadie, and Linda. Complications, my confusion, Charlie stated several times going back to the early 70s that Atkins knew Sebring and slept with several of the hairstylist's famous cocaine and acid clients. He repeated those victims to me, so how could there be anything random about the victims? It would be many years before Sexy Sadie's admissions to her carnal knowledge of the promiscuous Sebring was confirmed to me by woman Atkins had confided to in prison. And the old commercial tagline for Clairol said, "Only a hairdresser knows for sure." And thrice told anecdote that didn't add up, Charlie quite credibly described to me his anger and dismay when Atkins returned from Cielo Drive to the ranch to report what they'd done. According to Charlie, Atkins, high in adrenaline and speed, giddy from the gory scene she just witnessed, crowed to him, "I just killed myself and I give you the world." To which Charlie snapped back, "You dumb fucking cunt. I had the world and you put me back in jail again." Now you did make the sense in light of his supposed a prior knowledge and grudgingly approval of the copycat killing plan. In a recent of events that sounded vivid and realistic to me, it made it sound as if a confirmation with the victim of some unexplained bone of contention escalated unexpectedly to murder. Charlie also repeated that he knew Tex was going to do something that night, but had no idea what he was planning exactly. He said his young companions freaked out, panicked, and scrambled from the crime scene, leaving him to go back to clear away evidence. These things that Cielo didn't go down as planned was also made clear in another revealing statement he made to Geraldo Rivera. Tex went crazy, man. He went out of his mind. Dumb shit brought us all down. He did that assessment fit into the purported malice afterthought the girls cooked up? Along with the glaring inconsistencies, I have taken note that Charlie was completely willing to his own up to all the violent criminal acts he'd been accused of. True to his old convict motto, if you did the crime, do the time, he gladly and even proudly admitted that he was guilty of shooting Bernard Crow, cutting Gary Hinman, and being part of the posse that stabbed Shorty Shea. In one of our discussions, he mocked the most dangerous man alive, tagged Rolling Stone, dubbed him with back in 70s, saying that those three relatively routine felonies were a sad showing for the most dangerous man alive. He bragged that there was others much earlier crimes going back to the 60s he was responsible for that nobody would ever know about because he committed them in the zone of darkness. He told the 92 parole board that he'd been jailed in Mexico where I'd been accused of killing some French people and a couple of dudes in Acapulco. His remorseless admission of guilt when it came to these and other felonies, made it adamant that he was not responsible for the killings at Cielo Drive seemed all the more plausible. Already one of the most despised beings on the planet, knowing full well he'd never be paroled, and what would he have to lose by confessing to one more crime among the many he'd already shamelessly admitted to he was guilty of? Another factor that committed me that the bizarre theories generated accepted about the murders must be nonsense was something that I observed about Charlie. The only crimes he contemplated from the moment I knew him until his demise were exclusively scams and schemes about money. As he thought he was being ripped off financially, rightly or wrongly, he raged openly about wreaking revenge. Anyone who reneged on paying him what he felt he was owed was on his list. Nothing unusual about that. It was just the underworld code. And the time I knew Charlie, he openly expressed code but clear homicidal wishes about 4 people who I know of. He believed that all of them, including Neil Edmonds and 2 others I was then well acquainted with personally or financially, betrayed him. Because of his businesslike approach to crime, the idea that Charlie participated in murders for such delusional, ideological, or abstract reasons as Bugliosi claims seemed ridiculously unlikely. Like most professional criminals, if there was nothing material to be gained or no paycheck for a financial wrong to be righted, the Charlie Manson I knew wouldn't have taken the risk. And if he had commanded the Cielo carnage, as he insisted, it was hard to believe that Watson, the meth head physically responsible for the surreptitiously intimate overkill, wasn't settled to score of his own. And that was the case, however, I couldn't imagine that Charlie wanted a cut of whatever loot was absconded with. Speaking of risks, the record shows that Charlie was more than capable of violence himself. Like most of the criminals I've known, I observed that he lacked impulse control or regard for consequences. He demonstrated this in his fearless, reckless, and foolhardily willingness to do his own shooting and stabbing in the Crow, Hinman, and Shea confrontations. On the night of the murders, despite the great risk, he dared to go back to the crime scene, even though he could have easily been apprehended or encountered visitors stopping by. So the commonly expressed idea that Charlie was a coward who sent inexperienced youngsters to do dirty work for him, whatever the impotence, also didn't hold up. I suspected then, and I believe all the more now, that the freeing Bobby narrative Charlie was other commune members frequently expressed was as much of an evasive half-truth cover story as Bugliosi's helter-skelter itself. I could see from the psychological point of view why these idealistic youngsters in the commune who didn't participate in the crime would prefer to sincerely believe that the grisly murder spree that ended their joyful utopian dream was really a notable selfless act of love. From what I'd seen of Charlie's methods, I could easily imagine him explaining away the bloodshed to his more naive companions as something far more altruistic than it actually was. Greed, after all, isn't groovy. Such materialistic motives of outright robbery contradicted the Spawn clan's communal ethos, even if they survived on stolen checks and credit cards. The helter skelter and love of brother scenarios, despite grains of truth in both of them, seem to me to convincingly serve as misdirection from the real mystery. Why massacre these specific perfect strangers with such apparently vindictive ferocity? Charlie, I soon learned, might hint and speak in metaphor about the blue-eyed Oriental, the Frenchman's foils, Hinman's bagpipes, and an Indian princess who he never snitched on others. And it was obvious that all the other parties on every side of the whore had plenty of reasons not to rattle those old bones from their unquiet graves. So co-defendants dutifully told oddly nebulous variations on the story the court convicted them on because they knew that their only hope in hell was to ever win parole. The Hollywood lead, whose party was so suddenly crashed by the commune, they welcomed in with open arms and even more open legs, certainly weren't going to admit that they were in the same devil's business as Tex Watson. I assumed the secrets would remain forever buried. During the first 3 years of the 1990s, I optimistically amused that my work concerning Charlie was finished. My steady communications with him became simply friendly, personal exchanges devoid of any mention of the murders. It was only when I personally realized that I returned to Los Angeles after a residency in Vienna, and I was found in the slick city where the crimes happened, ripe for unexpected revelations from an even more unexpected source. I wasn't looking for them. They found me. The next chapter is The Man Who Killed the 60s. And the one after that, they go into so many mafioso characters that have connections to everything and everybody. It is amazing. So if you like what I'm doing here, please like and subscribe. If I don't get 150 likes, I might not be able to continue. We pray for all the friends and family and children.